Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I should have known better than to trust memory when it came to finding the old quarry. But grief has a way of making you believe you can reclaim what's lost, even when what's lost is a version of yourself that died with your brother 3 winters ago. The trail up Sourwood Ridge hadn't been maintained since the Forestry Service abandoned it in the 80s, and what remained was more suggestion than path. Rhododendron thickets pressed close on either side, their waxy leaves still beaded with morning dew that soaked through my pants legs with each step. The air tasted of moss and creek water, that particular Appalachian sweetness that comes from centuries of leaves rotting into black earth. I'd been hiking for 2 hours when I found the first marker stone. Tommy and I had stacked them here when we were kids, crude cairns to mark our secret route to the abandoned slate quarry where we'd spent every summer afternoon until high school pulled us in different directions. The stones were still there, grown over with lichen and settled deeper into the earth than I remembered, but unmistakably our work. The quarry had been our sanctuary, a place where 2 brothers could pretend they were explorers discovering lost civilizations, where we could skip stones across the black water that filled the old pit, where Tommy would sing those old ballads Grandma had taught him while I listened from the sun-warmed rocks. His voice had been something pure in those days, clear as the mountain air, untouched by the addiction that would eventually hollow him out from the inside. I was coming back because I'd found something in his belongings after the funeral. A letter, addressed to me but never sent, talking about the singing stones and how he needed to return to them. How he'd been hearing them call to him in his dreams, their voices mixing with Grandma's old songs until he couldn't tell the difference between memory and whatever was pulling him back to these mountains. The letter made no sense, of course. Stones don't sing. But grief makes you grasp at mysteries, especially when the alternative is accepting that your brother shot heroin into his arm one last time and simply stopped breathing in a gas station bathroom outside Beckley. The trail curved around a massive oak whose trunk bore the scars of old blazes, and suddenly I was standing at the edge of the quarry. The pit was exactly as I remembered it, maybe 60 feet across and half as deep, filled with water so dark it looked like polished obsidian. The walls were stepped ledges of gray slate, carved by men who'd been dead for decades, and the whole place held that cathedral quiet that comes with abandoned things. But something was different. Along the far wall where the slate had been cut deepest, someone had arranged stones in a pattern I didn't recognize. Not the random cairns Tommy and I had built, but something deliberate, almost ritualistic. Dozens of small stones balanced in impossible configurations, some stacked 20 high without mortar or support, others forming spirals that seemed to twist deeper into the rock face than the eye could follow. I worked my way around the quarry's rim, boots crunching on loose shale, until I stood directly above the arrangements. Up close I could see that each stone had been carefully selected, their surfaces worn smooth by water and time. They weren't local slate but something else, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they were humming, not audibly, not in any way my ears could detect, but I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. If you've ever stood too close to high-voltage power lines and felt that electric tension in the air, you'll understand the sensation. It made my teeth ache and my vision swim at the edges. I should have left then. Should have turned around and hiked back down the ridge to my car, driven home to Ohio, and found a therapist to help me process my grief like a normal person. But the letter was still folded in my back pocket, and Tommy's words kept echoing in my head. He'd written about the stones choosing certain people, about old songs that predated the settlers who'd carved these mountains into farmland and coal mines, about voices that called to those who carried too much sorrow. I made camp on the quarry's eastern rim, where a flat shelf of stone provided a natural terrace. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge, painting the sky the color of old blood, and I wanted to be settled before dark. I'd brought enough supplies for 3 days, though I couldn't have explained why I thought I'd need that long. The evening sounds were all wrong. No whippoorwills, no screech owls, not even the distant yip of coyotes that usually echoed through these hollows after sunset. Just silence, broken only by the occasional plop of a stone falling into the quarry water far below. Each time I heard that sound, I'd peer over the edge, trying to spot what had fallen, but the water's surface remained undisturbed. I tried to eat the sandwich I'd brought, but my stomach felt sour. Instead, I sat on the ledge and watched the last light fade from the sky, thinking about Tommy and the summer we'd spent here before everything went wrong. He'd been 15, I'd been 13, and we'd discovered we could make the quarry walls echo if we shouted loud enough. Tommy had tried singing instead, and the sound had been beautiful, his voice bouncing off the stone until it seemed like angels were singing back. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind through the trees, but growing stronger as the darkness deepened. Singing. Not Tommy's voice, but something else, something older and sadder, and infinitely more patient. The melody was familiar, one of those ancient ballads that had crossed the ocean with the first settlers, but the words were lost to time and distance. The singing seemed to come from the stones themselves, from the impossible arrangements on the quarry's far wall. As I listened, more voices joined the first, harmonizing in ways that made my chest tight and my eyes water. They sang of loss and longing, of things buried too deep to dig up, of love that persisted beyond death and reason. I found myself humming along, though I didn't know the tune. The melody seemed to carve itself into my brain, note by note, until I was singing words I'd never heard before in a language I didn't recognize. The voices from the stones grew stronger, more insistent, and I realized they were calling me down to the water's edge. I don't remember climbing down into the quarry. One moment I was sitting on the rim, the next I was standing waist-deep in water so cold it burned my skin. The arranged stones were directly in front of me now, and I could see they weren't just balanced on the ledge but grew from it, as if the rock itself had been shaped by patient hands over centuries. The singing was overwhelming now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from inside my own skull. I recognized some of them. Tommy's voice, young and clear the way it had been before the drugs. Grandma's voice, teaching us those old songs on summer evenings. My father's voice, dead now for 10 years, calling my name the way he had when I was small and afraid of the dark. But there were others too, voices I didn't recognize but that felt familiar anyway. Women singing lullabies in languages that might have been Cherokee or Creek. Men chanting work songs that matched the rhythm of axes and hammers. Children laughing and calling out in games that hadn't been played for generations. The water around me began to glow with a phosphorescent light that seemed to come from the stones themselves. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, pale forms that might have been fish, or might have been something else entirely. They swirled around my legs like curious cats, and their touch sent electric shocks through my nervous system. I don't know how long I stood there, singing along with voices that belonged to the dead and the never-born. Time moved strangely in that place, stretching and contracting like a heartbeat. The moon wheeled overhead, and I watched seasons change in the span of minutes, leaves falling and growing and falling again in an endless cycle. When I finally waded back to shore, my clothes were dry and the sun was rising. I'd lost an entire night to the singing stones, but it felt like I'd lived a lifetime in their embrace. The arrangements on the quarry wall had changed, grown more complex, and I could see my own handprints pressed into the stone beside them. I packed my gear with shaking hands and climbed back up to the rim. The trail down the ridge seemed shorter than I remembered, and I found my car still parked where I'd left it, though it was now covered with a fine layer of dust that suggested more time had passed than I could account for. I drove home to Ohio that day, but I brought something back with me. The songs, mostly. They play in my head now, especially at night when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts. Sometimes I catch myself humming melodies I've never heard, words forming on my lips in languages I don't speak. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when sleep is still heavy in my bones, I hear Tommy's voice calling to me from the stones, not the broken voice of his final years, but the pure, sweet sound of the boy who used to sing ballads across a quarry filled with dark water and older memories. The letter is still in my desk drawer, the one he never sent. I've read it so many times the paper is soft as cloth, but I think I understand now what he was trying to tell me. Some places hold on to the voices of those who've loved them, and some losses are too deep to ever fully heal. The singing stones don't take away the grief, but they give it a melody, a harmony that makes it bearable. I haven't returned to the quarry, but I will. The songs are getting stronger, more insistent, and I can feel them calling me back to that place where sorrow becomes music and the dead sing lullabies to the living. When I do go back, I don't think I'll be coming home again. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to add my voice to the chorus, to let the stones hold on to something of who I was before the world carved all the music out of me. The mountains remember everything, and sometimes, if you know how to listen, they'll sing their memories back to you in voices that sound like everyone you've ever loved. I came to the Blue Ridge that October to scatter my grandmother's ashes, though I suppose that's not entirely true. The ashes were just an excuse. What I really came for was to understand why she'd spent her final 3 months humming a tune I'd never heard before, staring out her nursing home window toward mountains she couldn't see from her bed in Charlotte. The melody had haunted me since her funeral. Not because it was beautiful, though it was in a way that made my chest ache, but because it felt familiar. Like something I'd heard in a dream, or in the moments between sleeping and waking when the mind plays tricks on itself. The nurses said she'd started humming it the day after her stroke, when the words had mostly left her, but the music somehow remained. They'd tried to identify it, thinking it might be an old hymn or folk song that would comfort her, but no one recognized it. Not even my mother, who'd grown up hearing grandmother's entire repertoire of mountain ballads. The drive from Charlotte took me through Asheville and up into the national forest where she'd grown up. Her handwritten directions, folded in my jacket pocket since the funeral, led me off the main highway onto gravel roads that wound between ridges thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint sound of running water over stone. The GPS on my phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but grandmother's directions were specific. Past the rusted mailbox with no name, left at the lightning split oak, follow the creek until the road ends. I parked at the end of a logging road that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Saplings grew through cracks in the abandoned asphalt, and kudzu vines had begun their patient work of reclaiming the artificial scar in the landscape. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, weighted with the accumulated silence of years. I shouldered my pack and hiked up through a grove of ancient hemlocks that towered overhead like cathedral columns. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the forest floor lay in perpetual twilight. My boots crushed through layers of fallen needles that hadn't been disturbed in years, each step releasing the earthy perfume of decomposition and renewal. After 20 minutes of climbing, following what might have been a deer trail or might have been the ghost of an old footpath, I reached the clearing she'd described in her notes. It was a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, surrounded by limestone outcroppings that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The rock was old, Paleozoic limestone that had been here when these mountains were young, and it was stained with mineral deposits that painted abstract patterns in rust and green across its surface. At the center of the clearing, a spring bubbled up from a crack in the rock. The water was so clear it seemed almost artificial, like looking through window glass. The spring formed a shallow pool maybe 10 feet across, and I could see every pebble on the bottom, every grain of sand that had been polished smooth by centuries of gentle current. But it was the stones around the pool's edge that stopped me cold. They weren't ordinary river rocks. Each one was perfectly round, polished smooth as glass, and they were arranged in a precise circle around the water's edge. Some were small as marbles, others large as bowling balls, but all were the same impossible shade of deep gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they hummed. Not loudly, just a low, persistent vibration that seemed to come from inside the stone itself, as if each one contained a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. When I knelt to touch one, the humming stopped. The silence was so abrupt it made my ears ring. When I pulled my hand away, it resumed, as if the stone had been holding its breath. I moved around the circle, touching each stone in turn. The same thing happened every time. Silence at contact, resumption when I withdrew. But I began to notice something else. The stones weren't humming randomly. They were harmonizing, creating a melody that raised the hair on my arms and made my teeth ache with recognition. It was the same tune grandmother had been humming in the nursing home. I scattered her ashes into the spring, watching them swirl and disappear into the dark crack where the water emerged. As I spoke her name aloud, Margaret Ellen Hutchins, born in these mountains in 1932, died in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and industrial carpet. The humming grew louder. The stones seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and I realized the melody was changing, evolving, learning. The sound resonated in my bones, in the hollow spaces between my ribs. It was less like music and more like a conversation, as if the stones were responding to my presence, incorporating my heartbeat and breathing into their ancient song. I found myself humming along without conscious thought, my voice weaving between their tones like a thread through cloth. That night I camped in the clearing. I'd brought a small tent, but the October air was mild, and something about the enclosed space felt wrong. Instead, I laid out my sleeping bag on a flat section of limestone near the spring and watched the stars emerge through the canopy. The humming continued after dark, joined by other sounds I couldn't identify. Not animal sounds, but something older, like the mountain itself was singing. Occasionally I caught what might have been an echo from deeper in the forest. Other stones, other springs, all contributing to a vast network of sound that stretched across the ridges like a web. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened, and slowly began to understand that the melody was changing. Not just evolving, but learning. The stones were analyzing my breathing, my heartbeat, the small sounds I made as I shifted position. They were learning to mimic me, to incorporate my presence into their song. When I hummed along, they adjusted their harmonies to match. When I held my breath, they paused. When I sighed, they sighed back in perfect pitch. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories. I saw grandmother as a young woman walking through this same forest, following paths that existed only in the spaces between trees. I saw her kneeling by the spring, not as an old woman scattering ashes, but as a child listening to the stone's song for the first time. In the dream, she was humming, and the stones were humming back, teaching her a melody that would stay with her for the rest of her life. By morning, the stones had rearranged themselves. I was certain of it, though I couldn't say exactly how. The circle seemed tighter, more purposeful. Some of the smaller stones had moved closer to the water's edge, while others had shifted position within the ring. The pool seemed deeper, the spring flowing stronger, and when I packed up to leave, I found I was humming the tune under my breath. The melody now burned into my memory like a brand. I drove home to Charlotte, but the humming followed me. Not the stones. They stayed in that hidden clearing, continuing their ancient song. But the melody itself had taken root in my mind, growing stronger each day. I found myself humming it at work, in the shower, while falling asleep. Colleagues began to notice. Friends asked where I'd heard it. I couldn't explain that it wasn't a song at all, but something alive, something that had been waiting in those mountains for someone to carry it back to the world. The truly unsettling part came 3 weeks later. I was walking through the city center, heading to lunch, when I heard it, my own voice, humming the melody from somewhere behind me. I turned but saw only strangers hurrying past with their heads down, lost in their own urban concerns. Yet the humming continued, perfectly synchronized with my own breath, as if the city itself had learned grandmother's song and was singing it back to me. I began to pay attention, to listen more carefully to the sounds around me. The melody was everywhere, hidden in the white noise of traffic, in the hum of air conditioning, in the distant rumble of construction. It was spreading note by note, voice by voice, carried by people who didn't even realize they were humming. I heard it in grocery stores, in office buildings, in the subway tunnels beneath the city. Children hummed it while playing. Teenagers tapped it out on their phones. Adults whistled it unconsciously while waiting in line. The song was viral in the oldest sense of the word, not digital, but organic, spreading through human contact like a contagion of memory. And I was the vector, the carrier who'd brought it down from the mountains and released it into the world below. If you've ever felt the weight of mountains in your bones, you might understand what I mean when I say some melodies are older than the people who sing them. They don't belong to us, we belong to them. They're not entertainment or art, but something more fundamental. The harmonic frequency of places that remember when the world was young. I returned to the clearing 6 months later, drawn by dreams that had grown more vivid with each passing night. The stones were still there, still humming, but their song had changed. It was richer now, more complex, incorporating melodies I recognized from the city streets. They had learned from me, and through me, they had learned from everyone else. The simple mountain song had become a symphony, a vast network of human voices all humming variations on the same ancient theme. The spring ran darker now, its depth impossible to measure. When I knelt to look into the water, I saw not my reflection, but the faces of everyone who had ever hummed the melody. Grandmother as a child, myself as I'd been that first day, strangers in Charlotte who'd never seen these mountains, but carried their song in their hearts. I still hear it sometimes, echoing from storm drains and subway tunnels, hummed by children who've never seen the Blue Ridge. The song is spreading, note by note, voice by voice, the way mountain streams eventually find their way to the sea. And late at night, when the city is finally quiet, I can almost hear those singing stones calling me home to that hidden clearing where the spring runs dark and deep, and the mountains remember songs that humans were never meant to learn. But we learned them anyway, the way we learn all dangerous things, by accident, by curiosity, by the simple act of listening too closely to sounds that should have been left undisturbed. And now the mountains have our voices, just as we have theirs, and the song continues to spread, seeking new throats to carry it, new minds to house it, new hearts to remember what we were before we forgot how to hear the music in the stone. Thomas returned to his mother's land to scatter her ashes, but the mountain had preserved secrets far older than death itself. The lawyers had presented a straightforward proposition: sell the 40 acres for enough money to cover the medical bills with a comfortable remainder. City developers stood ready to transform the space where medicinal plants had once flourished into vacation cabins for weekend tourists. But first, Thomas needed to honor his mother's final request. She had wanted her ashes spread in the hollow behind the deteriorating house, where her grandmother's ancestors had been buried before the cemetery received its consecrated ground. The driveway had surrendered to neglect since his mother's stroke. Red clay mud gripped the rental car's tires as Thomas navigated around washouts and fallen branches. October had arrived early in the North Carolina mountains, and the sourwood trees already displayed their scarlet warning against the gray sky. Everything appeared diminished from his childhood memories. The house sat askew on its stone foundation, tin roof streaked with rust, front porch sagging under the relentless weight of kudzu vines. 12 years had passed since his last visit. College had led to marriage, then divorce, then the kind of existence that keeps a person too occupied to visit dying relatives. The guilt settled in his chest like a physical weight, dense and immovable. The house retained its familiar sense of wood smoke and mason jars filled with preserved mysteries. His mother's presence lingered in every corner, quilts folded precisely on the cedar chest, reading glasses still perched on the kitchen table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. In the metal tin where she kept important papers, underneath the deed and insurance documents, Thomas discovered something that made his hands tremble. A letter addressed to him in her careful script, dated just 2 weeks before her death. The letter revealed truths that challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about his family's history and the mountain itself. His mother had written about his great-great-grandmother Elizabeth, buried in the hollow along with others whose names had been lost to time. But they were not resting peacefully, disturbed since the mining company had dynamited the ridge in 1973. The blasting had cracked something ancient underground, something that should have remained sealed. The dead had begun walking that very night, but not in the manner of horror films. They simply stood in the mist, waiting for someone to remember them properly, to mourn them as they should have been mourned when they passed. Elizabeth appeared at the edge of the clearing, exactly as his mother had described. She wore a blue dress that might have been beautiful once, but now it hung in tatters around her thin frame. Her hair was the color of old pewter, and her face was younger than Thomas had expected, but worn with a sadness that seemed to pull at the very air around her. She was not solid. Thomas could see the dark shapes of the hemlock trees through her form, but she was undeniably present, more real than the mist, more tangible than the fading light. When she looked at him, her eyes held recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment for longer than he could comprehend. She raised one pale hand and pointed toward the far side of the clearing. Through the thickening mist, Thomas could make out movement. More figures emerged from between the trees, each one dressed in the style of different eras. A woman in a Victorian morning dress, a man in work clothes from the 1920s, children in simple homespun that could have been from any decade in the last century. They moved without sound, their feet making no impression on the soft earth. But they all looked at Thomas with the same expression Elizabeth wore, not malevolent, but desperately sad, as if they were trying to communicate something vital that he could not understand. The fog continued to thicken until Thomas could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. The figures kept coming, dozens of them now, forming a loose circle around the graves. They stood perfectly still, watching him with eyes that held decades of unspoken grief. Then Elizabeth began to communicate, though her lips did not move and the words seemed to come from the mist itself. The message formed in Thomas's mind without sound, clear as if she had spoken aloud. They were the unmourned, the forgotten sorrows. Thomas understood then what his mother had meant. These were not malevolent spirits or restless dead seeking revenge. They were the accumulated grief of generations, the sorrows that had been buried with the bodies but never properly released. The mining company's dynamite had cracked more than just rock. It had broken the boundary between the living and the dead, between spoken grief and the silence that swallows pain. The figures began to move closer, and Thomas could see their faces more clearly now. Each one carried the unmistakable marks of loss: a mother who had buried children, a father who had died too young, lovers separated by circumstance or death. Their sorrow was so palpable it made his chest ache. The message continued to form in his mind. They wanted their stories told, their names spoken, the living to know they had existed. Thomas found himself nodding, though he did not understand how he could fulfill such a request. Most of the headstones were too weathered to read, and the stories these people carried had died with them decades ago. But then he remembered his mother's letter, and something she had said about the mountain remembering bloodlines. He was a Harrow, descended from these very people. Their blood ran in his veins. Their memories lived in his bones, passed down through generations of women who had kept the old ways alive even as the world changed around them. Thomas knelt beside Elizabeth's grave and placed his hand on the damp earth. The moment his skin touched the soil, the memories flooded through him like water through a broken dam. Elizabeth's life unfolded in his mind, her childhood in the hollow, her marriage to a man who died in a mining accident, her struggle to raise 4 children alone, her death from fever during a particularly harsh winter. But more than the facts, Thomas felt her emotions: the bone-deep weariness of endless work, the fierce love for her children, the quiet despair of knowing she would never see them grow up. The other spirits' stories followed, each one a thread in the tapestry of sorrow that had been woven in this hollow over the course of more than a century. Thomas saw through their eyes, felt their losses as if they were his own, understood the weight of grief that had been accumulating here for generations. They had been waiting for someone who could carry their stories back to the world of the living, someone who could acknowledge their existence, their pain, their humanity. The mountain had called Thomas back, not just to scatter his mother's ashes, but to serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. Thomas spent the rest of the night in the hollow, absorbing their stories, speaking their names aloud, letting their grief flow through him and out into the world. With each story he received, each name he spoke, the figures grew slightly more solid, more at peace. As dawn approached, the mist began to thin. The spirits' forms became less distinct, but their presence felt lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Elizabeth was the last to fade, and before she disappeared entirely, she smiled, the first time Thomas had seen joy on any of their faces. Her final message of gratitude formed in his mind, and then she was gone. Thomas climbed out of the hollow as the sun rose over the ridgeline, feeling older than his years but strangely peaceful. The mountain was quiet now, but it was the natural quiet of a place at rest, not the oppressive silence of accumulated grief. He never sold his mother's land. Instead, Thomas moved back to the mountains, took a job at the local historical society, and began collecting the stories of families who had lived and died in these hills. He wrote them down, preserved them, made sure they were not forgotten. It became his life's work, and he had never felt more purposeful. But sometimes, especially on misty October mornings, Thomas still visits the hollow. He brings flowers for the graves, tends the small garden he has planted there, and listens for voices in the wind. The spirits do not appear anymore, but he knows they are still there, finally at peace. Their stories safely held in the hands of the living. The mountain remembers everything. It remembers blood and bone, love and loss, the weight of sorrows that were never spoken aloud. And now, through Thomas, it remembers mercy. Some traditions are about honoring the dead, others are about freeing them. Thomas learned the difference in a hollow full of mist, surrounded by the accumulated grief of generations, and he has never been the same.